Well, this is probably going to be one of the last of these that I do for a little while. I've got a feeling I'm about to get shellacked by work. So before I do that, I wanted to kind of get some of the other stuff rattling around my head, out of my head, and into one of these, whatever these are. I mentioned in, I think, the last of these, again, whatever these are that I did, um, that there's kind of this connection between specifically books and music that has been I guess just something I focused on as of late. Not only just those, but just art, however you want to define art. That's a whole rabbit hole for another day. Um, but just how interconnected different mediums of that are. I think on the more higher resolution end of stuff, that you get kind of a more in detail, clearly mapped out sort of idea of some concept or some idea or some emotion or whatever is just like books, stories. They do a better job at that. And then I think on the complete opposite end of that spectrum is music, and I guess like the visual arts, paintings, sculpture, that sort of thing, where it gives you a very low resolution idea of something. Not to say that one is better or worse than the other, but I think you kind of have to overlay all of those to get a more complete idea of whatever that idea is that you're trying to get at. So, uh, with this one, I wanted to highlight specifically some books that are based off of songs and some songs that are based off of books, that sort of thing. I guess I'll start on this with some of the ones I was thinking of that don't, in my mind, have a lot of like substantive stuff going on. They're kind of just allusions to different things. Um, I guess off the Led Zeppelin 4 album, their like big album, the one with Stairway to Heaven and all that, you get kind of their, it's one of those songs on a big album that just gets forgotten completely. But the Battle of Evermore is on that same album, and I think I said in the last of these, Robert Plant, the lead guy, the vocalist and lyricist for Led Zeppelin, was doing a lot of reading through the Lord of the Rings when they were like at their peak, and in that song you get allusions to like the ring race and to the Witch King and all that. Actually, if I'm not mistaken, off that same album, Misty Mountain Hop, that song apparently is a reference to one of the places that they visit in The Hobbit. I haven't read The Hobbit, so I'll have to just trust that wherever I heard that, they were right. Another one that's kind of just illusions is Backcountry by Steely Dan. That's next on the list. Backcountry by Vince Sevenfold, which is quite literally just all the lyrics to that song, or at least most of them, are just different quotes from Hunter S. Thompson in books that he wrote. Speaking of Steely Dan, this is one where I'm going to kind of push the lines of what I can get by with saying on YouTube. So if my mother happens to be seeing this, avert your eyes and your attention and all that. But apparently, what I said vaguely in another of these, I'm going to get into specifics. Apparently, the guy that wrote, there was a guy in the 50s, like part of the beatnik generation, the proto-hippies, all that. He was writing this book. I forget his name. He was actively strung out on heroin while he was writing this book, the book that would go on to be Naked Lunch, I think is the name of it. But it's this kind of psychedelic, really trippy stream of consciousness sort of thing where it's kind of, I can't remember the word for the life of me all of a sudden. Silhouettes, that's not quite the word I'm looking for. Little short, disconnected scenes. And one of these scenes is written from the perspective of a sentient dildo named Steely Dan. And that's apparently, they looked at that and decided we've got our band name for whatever reason. To get to more substantive stuff, I guess. I won't talk too much about this one because I already did this in another, I think like the first one of these that I ever did. But the Leviathan album by Mastodon, which is weird in and of itself. You get a metal album based off of Moby Dick. It's even weirder when I try to picture Brent Hines, R.I.P., and his face tattoo sitting there reading Moby Dick. But they base an entire album off of Moby Dick. And again, I won't harp too much on it because I already did that in another one of these and I want to get to other stuff. But to reiterate a little bit, I do think that it's very helpful to listen to that album if you're going to read through that book, because it does actually help you get another angle that I think you would miss by just reading through it. It kind of highlights the kind of this anger, this wrath sort of tone that Ahab kind of exemplifies, but I think kind of underpins that whole book. It also was a little weird to me that a lot of the titles and a lot of the titles of the songs are just quotes from the book, and there's a lot of other quotes and characters and like events from the book, excuse me, that get referenced throughout that album, but they normally use them out of context from the way that they did in the book. Like for example, like the big track off of that album, Blood and Thunder, that is a line literally from one of the scenes in the book. I think it's from Ahab. You get the like big epic ending track, Hearts Alive, is another quote from the book from well, I won't get into who the characters that say it and where they say it and all that, but another quote from the book. But neither one of those are used in that context. Well, used in the context that they use them in the album. Again, don't want to harp too much on that. So before I start talking in circles, let me get to the two that I actually did want to talk a bit about. Sympathy for the Devil is probably the biggest of these insofar as like albums, songs, music generally that was inspired by books, because this was the Rolling Stones at their peak as well. And apparently the entire basis for that song was just the book, The Master and Margarita. That was written by Mikhail Bulgakov. Hopefully I'm saying that right. He was, to give, I guess, a short bio of his life, because that's actually going to become relevant to this. He was, I think, born in like the late 1800s, early 1900s, somewhere around there. So by the time he's my age, the Soviet Union is very much a thing. And I think he became a writer pretty late in life. He was like 30-ish or something like that by the time that he started writing, if I'm not mistaken, which I might be mistaken on that. But the thing I do know is that this was obviously an era in the Soviet Union where writers, but just artists more broadly, were having to be very careful with what they said through their art, because if it didn't toe, this is like peak of Stalinism, and if it didn't, whatever their message was, didn't toe the party line, they might end up in some trouble. Maybe they're exiled, maybe they're thrown off in the gulag, maybe they're taken from their house in the middle of the night and just nobody sees them ever again, that sort of thing. Or probably more commonly, their funding is pulled from the state, or they're blacklisted, that sort of thing. Bulgakov kind of manages to get away from all that. He kind of slides through all that because he happens to be Stalin's favorite writer. He was mostly a playwright, if I remember right. He would occasionally write kind of short stories. I think The Master and Margarita might have even been the only like actual full-length novel that he ever wrote in his life. And apparently, when he was starting to write it, he was starting to like draft it out. He one night just decided that it was this pointless endeavor, this book that he was working on, and so he took all the manuscripts, the rough drafts, and all that he'd been working on, and just like tossed them into his fireplace and just burned them all. And his wife kind of convinced him to take what he remembered from what he'd already written and to rewrite it and to actually finish the book, which apparently he did. Apparently he remembered most of what he'd written, and he managed to like actually finish the book or come really close to it before he died. Apparently also, there's a story I've heard about him where apparently, I don't know if it was along the same timeline as he's writing The Master and Margarita, but apparently he was going to kill himself, as in like not thinking about it. He had actively had a gun on the table in front of him and was about to pull the trigger. And then he gets a phone call in the middle of the night at like 10:30 at night, and it's Joseph Stalin on the other end calling about, I don't even know what it was, but calls him about something, and he manages to get talked down off of the ledge by Joseph Stalin himself, which was odd. I guess part of the reason he even was contemplating that sort of thing in the first place, he felt really hemmed in by the fact that he didn't have much freedom as far as what he wanted to actually talk about in the stuff he was writing, because again, had to toe the party line. So with The Master and Margarita, he kind of works in this really subtle, apparently if you were in the Soviet Union at the time, it wouldn't be very subtle. He was like calling out stuff that you would have seen in the news in that day and time. But this kind of subtle, at least subtle enough to slip past me the first time I read through it, kind of critique, this parody, this satire of what was going on in the Soviet Union. I think the opening scene to that book in particular sticks out to me. There's these couple of writers. I should probably also say it's like a really kind of meta sort of story. There's a lot of writing about writers, and the whole story that I literally just said about him deciding that he didn't want to write this anymore and just burning it, and his wife talking him into finishing it. He manages to weave that story into the story itself, so you kind of get that weird element to it. But the opening scene in particular, a couple riders sitting on a park bench, and I think it was St. Petersburg and or Leningrad, I don't know what it was called at the time. Anyway, in St. Petersburg, and they're talking about something that one of them had written and whether or not they thought it was any good and they thought it would be successful and all that. And this guy walks up, and the only way I know to describe him is he's basically like a JoJo's Bizarre Adventure character come to life. He's like got this weird multicolored suit on. I think he's like 6'5" or something. He opens up this pocket watch, and he's got like a blue flame that starts shooting out of it, that sort of thing. And he starts asking them all these cryptic questions about whether or not they want to know when they die, and whether or not they believe in Jesus and all this. And one of the poets, the writers on this park bench, answers him and says, "This is the Soviet Union. Clearly, we don't think that Jesus existed. This is a rational humanist society, all that." And the guy looks at him like really closely and tells him that he can assure him that Jesus exists and that the devil exists, because he was there when Jesus was crucified, which obviously that line itself is kind of paraphrased and ripped for the song "Sympathy for the Devil." It's the devil. He's kind of come in disguise as this like magician, Votan, I think he says is his name, and he's come to the Soviet Union, and he kind of gets down to all these like antics and all that. Before I go on about that anymore, there's a line. I don't usually like laugh whenever I read anything. I don't really understand what people say, like this book had him dying laughing and all that. But this is one of those books. I won't say I actually literally laughed out loud, but it did make me grin at certain times. There was during that scene when they see him walking up and see how weird he's dressed. I think he has like one eyebrow shaved, if I remember right. And the guy's like, well, clearly he's a European, and just like he's kind of got that like, what's the phrase? That like dry humor sort of element to it. But I say that whole thing was really kind of fantastical and all that, because alongside that, there's this parallel story, the story that apparently Bulgakov himself was trying to write initially, that he weaves into the story itself. This parallel story that is told through flashbacks. Like you'll get a chapter that's in the modern day in St. Petersburg, and then it'll flash back, and you'll get a scene from this other story, which is this hyper-realistic retelling of the crucifixion of Jesus. And I say hyper-realistic because it seems like he takes pains to take away all the more fantastical elements and to like really try to ground it. He tries to like get into the psychology of all the characters in this kind of like, well, I guess again, realist sort of tone. But you get those bouncing back and forth, and I think it's odd that this retelling of the crucifixion of Jesus is the one that's told in this hyper-realistic way, and the story that's set in this rationalist humanist society in the Soviet Union is the one that's told in this fantastical, like, absurd way. He's probably trying to point something out about the Soviet Union or something like that with that. But to not harp on about that much more, I'll just say to tie it all back to Sympathy for the Devil. Apparently Mick Jagger, at the peak of the Rolling Stones fame, read that and used that as the entire foundation for that song. If you've heard that song, you even know it's written from the perspective of the devil, and it even says at one point that he decided to stop by St. Petersburg. That whole thing. The one I want to leave off with is definitely my favorite album out of all of these. One of my favorite albums, period. It is from Porcupine Tree. It's Fear of a Blank Planet. And apparently this one, from what I understand, was based off of a Bret Easton Ellis book. Bret Easton Ellis, if you don't know, is the guy that wrote American Psycho. I can't remember the name of this book that it was based off of, this album was based off of, but it was about latchkey kids growing up in the late 90s, early 2000s, that sort of era. And the album pretty much uses that as its same theme. It's written from the perspective of some teenager growing up in that era, and he's kind of this disillusioned sort of figure. His parents don't have much to do with him. He's kind of like raising himself, and their solution to all of his problems is to give him, more drugs. Here's some Adderall, here's this psychoactive drug, whatever. I just prescribe him some more stuff and fix his problems. Um, he kind of drifts through life, just kind of glazed over by the literal narcotics, but also just kind of cheap pleasures, that sort of thing. And actually, I literally have the album cover right here. I think the album cover does a really good job of like summing that up. Hopefully, I'm actually getting that in frame. I can't see. Uh, but I think the album cover itself does a really good job of like summing that up. Uh, I gotta be careful here because to say I don't know much about music theory would be the understatement of the century. But the like main track off of that album, the like central one, is Anesthetized, and it's this like giant 18-minute long like sweeping song. I like to think of it in like three different movements, and again, it's a shame that I don't know more about music or don't know anything about music theory because I think there's like a ton to pick apart with it. I'll try, and I'm gonna sound like a moron, but you get, I think, kind of three main sections, kind of movements of the song. The first of these is kind of the intro to it. It's the first like 5 minutes or so, and you kind of get introduced to the character and kind of what I've already said, that he's kind of drifting through life, that sort of thing. But then during the second movement is where things start to get like really heavy. This is probably their heaviest album that they ever put out. It gets really heavy, like to the level where it doesn't sound like anything else they've ever put out heavy. Like heavy, like even by metal standards. And it gets really busy too. And the lyrics during that part of the song are talking about this kind of inner turmoil that he's got to like actually break through this kind of going through the motions lifestyle that he's got, his kind of desire to get through that, and it kind of comes to a head and kind of comes to the point where like something has to give, and the music itself reflects that with how busy and how heavy it gets. And then like it gets really dissonant towards the end of that section, and then right when you think like you can't take anymore, it just stops, and you get the last movement of the song that they end out with, and it's this really tranquil, really serene, really just beautiful section where he's recounting this memory that he had as a kid, and it's some beach scene that he remembers, and it's like there's a lot of description of like his sensory emotions and that sort of thing. It's kind of told as this kind of break through the drug haze, and it kind of breaks into this last fleeting real memory that he had, and it like takes your heart and just pulls it in 18 different directions. The little bit that I know of music theory, I remember from my music appreciation class my freshman year of college, so I guess I got something out of that. But during that last section, they use a canon, like the musical term, not a literal canon, but they use a canon, which is one of those where like they kind of overlap the different chord progressions, the different. Here's where I'm gonna start to sound like a moron again. They have this theme they use for that, and they overlap it. Like it'll start, and then before it even ends, they'll start it again on repeat, and before that ends, they'll start it again, and it gives it all this really dreamlike, fleeting sort of feel to it, which I think really like drives the point home that they're trying to make with that. It's one of those albums that is like criminally under acknowledged, probably because it's an 18-minute long song at the middle of it. But I think it is. I think if you're going to get into any like substance like that, you have to have something maybe that long. It's hard to get at something like that in 50 pages or in some 2-minute glorified ringtone jingle sort of thing. I never know how to end these. I've said that before, so I'm just going to end this. Bye.